I'm Captain Don Gerling, Canadian Army Reserve, CIC, and I have with me today a retired Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McKenzie. It's my pleasure to be able to interview you today.
Thanks, Don. It's interesting to be on this side of the interview as I'm usually doing the interviewing. And thank you for having me.
That's great. I'm really interested in your story because, as I understand the history, you basically grew up in an Army family.
Well, not really. My dad was the last commanding officer of the South Alberta Regiment, and he retired in '54 when the South Alberta Regiment was changed to the South Alberta Light Horse. And at that time, I was 5 years old. Going back, my dad joined the South Alberta Regiment prior to World War II. He was a captain in the South Alberta Regiment, working his way up through the NCO ranks to a sergeant major, got promoted. And when war was declared in '39, he joined immediately and ended up in the Calgary Highlanders. And as a result, he served the war in an infantry regiment, not in the South Alberta Regiment. And after the war, he rejoined the South Alberta Regiment and ended up being the commanding officer from, I think it was '51 to '54, when the regiment was changed from the South Alberta Regiment to the South Alberta Light Horse.
So there would have been lots of stories and memorabilia from your dad about his exploits in uniform?
Didn't talk too much to me about them, but I do remember some of the dinners his compadres from the Calgary Highlanders used to come down, and they would gather in our house, and I would hide behind the china cabinet and listen to all the stories of the Calgary Highlanders during the war. My first memory is going out to an exercise where it was a tank shoot when Lieutenant Colonel Rod Ray was commanding officer. And that piqued my interest. And as a result of that, I joined November 13, 1965, and retired when I was 16, and retired when I reached age 60 and was in 2009.
So you're pretty much all your adult life was in uniform. And your real job, I guess, was a teacher. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a teacher in the Medicine School District, and became a principal, and then went back to becoming a teacher, and retired in 2003.
How did you find the ability to walk in both shoes, being a teacher and also being so involved in the regiment over the years?
It took a lot because of being involved since I was 16, coming up right through until I was 60. I spent a lot of time in this armories throughout the years.
So when you were going to university, I take it the summers were probably on the military world?
I worked a lot with the military during the summers. In fact, I think I spent about in the years I was in, I probably spent about 25 summers away taking courses or teaching on courses. I spent a lot of time, most summers when I was an NCO, I spent away at Wainwright or Shiloh, or also spent time in Dundurn.
How did you find some of the training that you took in the military? Were you able to apply some of that in your teaching career?
I was able to apply a lot of it because the military teaches you how to plan, how to teach. My interest in teaching was actually established as a result of taking a junior NCO course up in Wainwright, and I was. We have a picture of my junior NCO class in 1966. And that piqued my interest in teaching. And in fact, I think I went into teaching as a result of my military experience.
Well, that's really an interesting reflection. You know, so often it's something else sparks the interest, but you have some family history, and then you're in the military already. and you get some training from them of how to teach that sparks your interest into a lifelong career as a teacher. That is a really interesting connection.
Well, it takes a lot of dedication to be a reservist, and there have been a lot of changes throughout the years.
Yes, there has.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I kind of would like to delve into a little bit. When you first got into the regiment, what were you using for equipment?
Back then we were using Sherman tanks, and I took my training initially as a tank driver and gunner, and also took my comms course using the old 19 sets. We have one in the museum here, and it's quite interesting because the 19 set that we used was made for Lend-Lease during the Second World War, and they had Russian language markings on them because these were the ones that were the same as the ones that were sent over to the Russians. And if you remember, during the Second World War, the Russians were our allies. And we went there, and I remember we had the last Sherman tank chute in Canada, and they shipped all the ammunition from all the ammunition depot across Canada to Suffield. And I think we ended up with something like 2,500 rounds, and we had 5 tanks. And by the end of that, we shot them all, and the tank barrels were quite shot out. You could almost hear them rattling down the barrel as you fired them. And that was the last tank chute I think in the Canadian Army. And then we went away to summer camp, and we had our tanks parked outside, and we came back and they were all gone. And that was telling us that, hey, you're out of tanks, you're switched over to reconnaissance. And we went into reconnaissance.
So what did when you went to the reconnaissance role, which is somewhat different than your frontline tank command, there obviously was training differences, but you also had now different vehicles. What did they transition you to?
That was an interesting story. We used a lot of Army surplus, 3/4-ton vehicles that we had to come up with the radio racks and the machine gun mounts and everything. And then we went to Jeeps. And again, we had to come up with the radio mounts because they weren't in there, transitioning to 42 set. And it was quite an interesting make-do experience in the Army at that time.
And so there was at some point they brought back another armored vehicle for you to use, and what did they call that?
The armored vehicles, we started off with the Lynx. We went away on a crewman course. It was a crew commander's course up in Calgary over the Easter weekend, and we started training on M113s, APCs, and Lynx at that time. And the regular force were just getting them. And a lot of the vehicles that we were using for that particular course had 10 miles on them, 5 miles. They were brand new. And they ran that course with 5 people from every armored regiment across Western Canada. And then we went away, and we used to draw the regular force vehicles and use them for 4 or 5 years in training on our military concentrations in Wainwright.
So for those that are not savvy with the terminologies, what did the Lynx actually look like? Was it a tracked vehicle? Did it have a turret?
It was a tracked vehicle. It was called an M113.5, and the Canadian Army was the only one that used them. It had a 3-man crew. It mounted a 50 caliber machine gun in a small exposed turret, and it was not that good a reconnaissance vehicle because it was very noisy, and also had a big diesel plume every time you moved out. And we used those for a while. We used M11 or Jeeps, 3/4 tons. And at one time, we even took ferret training in the ferret scout car that we have in front of the armories. And remember running a course or having a course run down here and qualifying on the Ferret, which was an interesting vehicle because it was 5-speed forward, 5 in reverse. And you just had a forward and reverse lever, and so you could go as fast in reverse as you could forward, but it was a scary vehicle if you had a driver you couldn't depend on.
So now, at this transitional point, then the focus of the regiment went from an armored regiment to an armored reconnaissance regiment. Is
Right.
that correct? And then we had further evolutions as you went through. Where do we go next?
We went back to an armored regiment in the 70s, late 70s. B Squadron, which is up in Edmonton, came under our adopted by the regiment down here. They wanted an armored presence up in Edmonton. And because of political factors within the military, they wouldn't reactivate one of the armored regiments in Edmonton. Therefore, squadron was established up there. They were up there, but they weren't under our command. They were sort of an independent squadron, and they actually became the tank trainer, or the Cougar squadron, and we were reconnaissance down here. So that continued for quite a few years, in fact, until I became CO. And at that time, they converted all of the reconnaissance regiments to Cougar regiments. And we had to, when I was CO, we had to do the transition training down here to bring this unit up to the Cougar. Then once we got all qualified at the end of that time in the 90s, then they took away the Cougar. I think the last Cougar exercise, was 2004, and up in Wainwright. And then they took the Cougars away and converted all the armored units to reconnaissance.
So now again, the Cougar, describe that particular.
It's a wheeled tank trainer. It mounts a 76 low velocity gun on it. And it was adopted as a tank trainer, was never supposed to see active service, although the regular force did take it to Bosnia. And I think it was on a few other peacekeeping missions, but they used the Cougar overseas. Although, again, it was never intended. It was supposed to be a tank trainer.
So I'm just going to go back just a little bit. You started out as a private soldier and moved through the ranks.
Well, I moved up quite fast, actually. I joined in November 13th, 1965. And the spring of 1967, I was promoted Lance Sergeant. And I take a look at, I was young. And the only reason I got Lance Sergeant was because we got our guidon presented in 1967. And we had a lot of Second World War vets. And they found out that a lot of them couldn't march. And they needed a left guide for our squadron that we had on parade, because we represented our guidon with the Calgary Highlanders. And so they needed a left guide, and I was picked because I could, obviously, because I could march. And I remember being the first man on the parade square on the parade, because I was the left guide for the right-hand company or squadron on the parade. And that was an interesting experience to go through that. And in fact, we're working on getting a new guidon within the next couple years. And I just think back, holy mackerel, that's 50 years ago that we got it in 2017. And then I went through, and I was acting RSM as a warrant officer, a master warrant officer, and a chief warrant officer. And one of the things going on, we had a CO back then by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Brian Moore, and he wrote me up for an award, and I got the Member of the Order of Military Merit, which is this medal, from the Governor General. And my certificate was signed by one Governor General, and I got it presented by another Governor General, and that was in Rideau Hall in Ottawa. And that was quite an interesting experience.
That's quite an honor to
Yeah.
have your medal presented at such a high level. I mean, the
Yeah.
highest regal in Canada.
And I was one of the first reservists to get the medal in Canada. We have one other member in the unit that just got his last year.
So, Chief Warrant Officer, a Regimental Sergeant Major, is sort of the top of the crust for the non-commissioned officers. And then explain the process of how you ended up moving up into the officer rank.
Well, I was talked into taking my commission after I served my 3 years as Regimental Sergeant Major. And I went right to captain, because as a Regimental Sergeant Major, you don't have to go through the lieutenant ranks. And that started a whole new experience, working my way through the system. And taking courses, and I was one of the older guys taking courses, because I was taking a lot of the courses with people or officers who were a lot younger. And one of the things I remember is taking my combat team commander's course, and that was up in Wainwright, and we had a squadron of Strathconas. We had a company of PPCLI, attached artillery, engineers, and we had a combat team, and that was quite interesting taking that course.
So now, as you got through as a captain in the regiment, what would your role be at that point?
I
primarily?
basically filled in all of the positions within the unit: adjutant, training officer, squadron 2IC, ops officer, and so learning as you go. And again, went away in a lot of concentrations, and summer concentrations away at Wainwright, Shiloh, Dundurn, and it was an interesting experience. They say that an officer runs a troop or a squadron, and it's the NCO's responsibility to make sure that squadron is in a position so the officer can take over and operate it. And it's quite a different area of responsibility, not as much fun. I never found my officer career as much fun as my NCO career, because I did like instructing, and I was a gunnery instructor. I was lucky to get my demolitions course, and a lot of other interesting training. I took my Militia Command and Staff College course in Kingston, and that was quite a drag back then. I think I had 28 weekends between October and June in Calgary and 9 in Winnipeg. So that doesn't allow you too much time. Plus there was hours of homework in taking that course.
That takes a lot of toll on your family, I would expect.
It did. And I was very lucky to have a supportive wife who backed me, and although and she had to take over a lot of the burden of the family when I was gone.
I don't think a lot of people realize the degree of sacrifice that people that choose to be reservists have to endure from the family side of it, because the time that they put in is such, a lot of it is away, and the training is not, so you're not home sleeping in your own bed.
No, and traveling too, being in Medicine Hat, you generally leave on a Friday, and you come home late Sunday, especially if you're driving to Wainwright. You have to get on the buses or drive your vehicles up to Wainwright, exercise Saturday, part of Sunday, get everything cleaned up, and then drive back. And it's a 5-hour trip up to Wainwright. So it was fairly arduous at times, and we put in a lot of time.
You're back up Monday morning in class teaching.
Yeah, and also one of the things I try to make family older recruits who come in who want to be officers, and try to make them realize what they're going to have to sacrifice. In many cases they say, yes, we're prepared to do it. And then when they get to the point where they have to do it, suddenly it becomes a big burden. And although they try a lot of them drop out because they don't realize the sacrifice involved.
It's massive.
Yeah.
It's massive. So you talked a little bit about the most part of it was the most fun. Can you give me a couple of stories about you as an NCO through there that would stick out in your mind, that were either of interest or perhaps amusing?
Well, I spent a lot of time as a sergeant because I reached there so fast, and I remember being up in Wainwright and arriving up and as a young sergeant, and I had 28 regular force corporals and master corporals working for me, and this was in the I think the late 60s, and we drew 28 armor personnel carriers. We taught 3 courses over the summer with these guys. I had a fantastic time. In fact, it was in 1970, and the reason I remember that is because my son was born, and he was supposed to be born early in July before I went up, and he ended up coming a wee bit later, and I was on course up there and had to come back when he was born. But anyway, we ran 3 courses with 28 APCs, and at the end of the time, did a check of all the equipment, and we ended up losing 1 3/8 drive socket, and I could tell them what vehicle it was in because it had dropped down. And I had a fantastic experience working with the NCOs in the Strathconas, and most of them had been in the Army longer than I'd been alive, because back then we had we had an older Army, and that was very interesting. And also I remember when the Strathconas were over in, I was teaching a course up in Wainwright, in Calgary in 1974. And I was orderly officer for the camp, and we got a phone call that said Recce Squadron is activated for the Strathconas, and this was the Cypress. In fact, the lieutenant in charge of the Recce Squadron was Greg Hilton, who ended up a general. But anyway, I had, I think, about 35 instructors on a course, and I got a phone call and had to phone the CO and tell him that we had a squadron or a troop activated. And this was Friday night, and they flew out of Calgary Sunday morning, heading to Germany, drew lynxes in Germany, and ended up landing in Cyprus on the Monday morning. And this was when a lot of the problems in Cyprus started, when the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And I had 3 weeks left in the course, and I lost about 3/4 of my instructors. So that involved a lot of phone calls to a lot of units trying to get instructors up to Calgary to take the course, which was, or to instruct the course, which was an interesting experience.
That is an amazing change from what's happened with our activation in Afghanistan. With you literally within a week you're from here and you're on the ground over there doing a job.
It was 3
Whereas
days.
3 days.
Yep.
And as I understand it, you correct me if I'm not right here, or that it was a 6-month pre-deployment for soldiers going to Afghanistan.
Yes.
Which is a significant change in the mindset and the training regimen.
Well, this was the regular force reconnaissance troop from the Strathconas, and they were supposed to be ready. Now I guess they don't figure that they're ready, and they get a lot of specific training, but when emergencies arise on the world stage, you sort of can't say, wait, we need to train. And this is one of the problems in now is getting sufficient time to get soldiers up to a level where they can deploy quite fast in almost a quick reaction situation.
Talking a little bit about that, the equipment was interesting that you talked about. The equipment in your early years was things you had to make do with and craft to make do with. And if you were called up as a reservist to augment the regular force, you would likely not see the real equipment that you'd be dealing with.
No, and that's been a big problem, especially when the regular force went to the Coyote. Although one of the things that happened when I was CO is that our unit did what they call the RAM trials out at Suffield on the Coyotes. Now, a RAM trial is when they take a vehicle and they run it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and to find out what the problems were. And we had a group from our unit here that participated in the RAM trials, doing a lot of the driving and the crew commanding for the Coyote. But then suddenly they said, well, when the initial buy for the Coyote went out, they said yes, it was going to be part of the reserve. But then they come up and say, well, can't do that. It's too complicated for the reserve. Therefore, although they bought it with a certain amount left for the reserve, it was taken over by the regular force, lock, stock, and barrel, and we were sort of cut out and on the periphery. And because we couldn't train with the regular force equipment, which we used to do, so, we couldn't then be deployed with the regular force without a lot of augmentation training. And that's what happened in Afghanistan, but a lot of the regular force had the same problem. They didn't have the equipment they were using over in Afghanistan, therefore they needed specialized training before they could go over. Interesting experience, and it'll be interesting what happens in the future with training.
Yeah, it makes sense. Even the tanks that we sent over, although they were Leopard 2s, I think the ones that they actually ended up getting were Leopard 2As, were quite different, and they actually had to do training to the Reg Force subsequent on the ground in Germany before they deployed.
Yeah, because we had the Leopard 1s in Canada. The Leopard 2s were in Afghanistan, and yes, in the pre-deployment training, they went to Germany to train on the Leopard 2s.
Now, along with those pieces of equipment, I'm interested to know what your experiences were, because from what I would gather, you probably were in at least 3 major changes of uniform during your career.
Oh, 3 major changes. Started off in battle dress.
Describe that.
Battle dress, it was basically the same uniform they used during the Second World War. We had puttees, and that's what we went on parade with on the Guidon presentation.
And it's heavy, thick wool.
It was heavy, thick wool, and we had that. We didn't get issued sleeping bags back then. We got issued a poncho with 2 gray blankets. And when we went out in winter warfare, we got 3 gray blankets. And there were some pretty miserable times spent out there. And then we started getting a wee bit more personal equipment. And we had bush dress, which is basically a work type dress. Although the Army insisted you starch it and get the creases in it and make sure everything's good. And then the Army got combat. Well, the combat wasn't authorized for the reserves. So we had to go out and buy our combat from the war surplus. And then we got into, when we were on the tanks, we just had coveralls. That's what we put on. We put coveralls on, and that was our dress. And then combat started to get issued. And then we had crew suits that were issued at a certain level. And these were rejects from the Air Force because they found out that the particular crew suit, if the pilots got in a crash, it melted into your body. Had zippers all over the place, and those were issued for a while for reconnaissance crewmen. And now, the combat that we have, the disruptive pattern combat, is some of the best equipment in the world. And the reserves are equipped very well now. The Army's equipped very well now. But back then, we had some terrible equipment that was approved. War surplus stock, our stuff from the Second World War. And we were still using it. We fired the Bren gun when I initially joined. And that got replaced by the FN. We had the 303. Again, that was replaced by the FN. And so we've worked our way up. We had Browning 303s initially. And then they went to the machine gun, the general purpose machine gun, and then they converted it to 7.62, which caused all sorts of problems because the conversions did not work well.
What did they convert? What was the caliber before? Did they change?
303.
It was 303?
Yeah.
Belt-fed 303?
Yeah, yeah.
So you've seen in the span of your career, you've seen such a change.
Well, the
in
radio,
the equipment and everything.
even radios, started off with the 19 set, went to the C42 as the basics, the 524 set, which was the American set, and now we have the Combat Net radios, which is quite a bit of difference. I mean, the jump from the 524 to the Combat Net radio was absolutely a leap in technology.
So was it those sorts of things that sparked your interest? As I understand it, when you got to the CO level, that you were a driving force in 2 history book publications that eventually came into practice. One called The Century Service.
One started. One was the South Alberta's A History of a Regiment at War, which got, and that's the one on this side. And the genesis of that got started during my term. And then in 2005, we had our 100th anniversary. And as a result of that, A Century of Service came out, and I was one of the contributing authors to that, which was quite interesting. And in addition, during my tour of as CO, we got the museum started. And that was a result of Sergeant Major Jim Ogston coming up and saying, "Sir, I'd like to get a museum started." And we encouraged him and gave him some money, gave him some time, and he worked on it and ended up developing just a fantastic museum out here.
So it became a passion, that would be fair to say, for you?
And we had the addition built on the armories during my tour, although a lot of that was put in place by Lieutenant Colonel Lindsay Fraser. when Suffield supported us. And during my tenure, they took away Suffield's support. And that really hurt the regiment, because Suffield did a fantastic job for us, because we were the only external unit to Suffield. And down here, supported by Edmonton, we're one of many. So it was a heck of a lot easier to get things from Suffield than, although part of my interest in all the time, when I retired in 1996, I was out for about 5 years. They didn't have a job for me. And then Lieutenant Colonel Neil Douglas gave me a call and said, would you like to come back and do some work as a major? And I said, sure. I always enjoyed it, and I missed it. And I came back from 2001 to 2009 as a major, and helped a lot with the unit. Got the interior redone, the stage replaced as being a CIC officer. I think we have some of the best facilities going in, all around facilities going. We have a lot of things going for us in the South Alberta Light Horse.
We certainly do, and this building itself has such a history to it.
Yeah, so well, it was part of the prisoner of war camp. It was a recreation hall, and this and the drill hall in the Stampede grounds are the only two buildings left. I mean, at one time there was 12,500 prisoners of war here. That was more than the population of Medicine Hat. And this was part of the building. And I still remember we owned or we operated the land from where the Armories is now right up to Dunmore Road. And I remember doing training there. We had the two messes, the sergeant's mess and the officer's mess. The officer's mess was about where Southview School is now. And the sergeant's mess was where the trailer court, it was by the old drive-in. And it was the theater from the prisoner of war camp. And the officer's mess was the mess from the prisoner of war camp. And there used to be a lot of foundations that we used to drive the tanks through, and so it was. There's been a lot of change. We were the only thing up here. There was a rifle range out back. I remember having the Sherman tanks and shooting the outdoor miniature range with 22s. We set up a range that was out there to give the guys gunnery practice, and it was a mount on the Sherman tank. There was a subcaliber attachment that we could shoot 22, so we could shoot little targets out on this range. And in fact, I still have at my house some of the poles that marked the range. They have 500, 2,000 on them, so you'd know the range to put it at.
Wow. So this whole area was undeveloped. You actually had your own training area right out your back door, essentially.
Yeah,
in those early
we
years.
did, and the skeet range was just a wee bit over where, just off Carey Drive, and they used to shoot skeet, and there was a rifle range out there, and back behind the Armories was an outdoor cinder track. And at one time I heard it was the best cinder track in Canada, because the prisoners made it, and it was an oval arrangement with seats along the side. And it was just a low thing, and it was with cinders that they collected from, because the buildings, that's how they were heated. There was no central heating. There was cold sort of during the winter, and they gathered the cinders and they formed the cinder track. So, and there were 3 outbuildings right across the door, across from the Armory, where Kyler Park is, or Curry Park is right now. There used to be 3 buildings there, and I still remember driving up here one Sunday, and somebody had driven the tank in the back of the range. And the tank was sitting in there. It punched the back of the range out, and and then we had a fire across the way, and lost a lot of our tech stores, because that's where the tech stores used to be, in the QM, and all our classrooms were across the way. And we used to come out Saturday morning at 6 o'clock. There was a group of us came out, and we would fire up the tanks, move them out of the building to let the diesel fumes dissipate before the rest of the unit arrived to go on parade on the parade square. And the area that we're in now, this used to be where the old boiler was that provided heat. Where we are right now provided heat for the building. There was a chimney up here, and a caretaker's shop, and a couple of the old caretakers, Wes Stenhouse and Bill Ferris, this was their pride and joy out here. They worked hard, ex-military guys, and then in the early 70s we lost that area, and they built this attachment in the armories at that time. So there have been a lot of changes here.
So this building has really served well, and has had many mortifications or morphisms.
There have been a lot of changes, and we've got so much support throughout the years. And I remember when one of the things, Stephen Stock, when his funeral took place in this building, and that was a terrible thing to go through. I was the ADAMA administration officer in charge of the funeral arrangements and that. And boy, it was a rewarding experience in many ways, because it's one of the few times in the military where I could phone up somebody and say I would like this, and bang, it happened. Nobody said, can we have a FIN code, who's paying for it? It just happened. Yes, we'll do that. And the engineers from Edmonton, 1st Engineer Regiment, had, I think it was 4 or 5 people killed in that incident, and so they were conducting the funeral services right across Canada. And as a result of the support they got down here, they do a training exercise where they train their new people, and they wanted a place to do some basic construction, and we got our Junior Ranks Club rebuilt, and we got our bathrooms rebuilt through the auspices of the 1st Engineer Regiment for very little labor cost. I think that we provided through the, at that time, Alberta District, we provided the materials, and the engineer squadron did the labor. Just lived in the armories and did a fantastic job.
With all the things that you, and I'll just say, not necessarily as a commanding officer, but as your role as a leader here, what things stand out in your mind as the greatest satisfactions of achievement that you were able to accomplish with respect to changes or augmentations for the regiment as a whole?
The thing that stands out in my mind is taking a look at how the people change when they come into the unit, and no matter when they leave, how they benefit from being in the military. And throughout the years, I take a look at some of the ones that I taught, and going on to do very well in the military. And that was one of the biggest impacts on how military service changes people. I've had quite a few parents come out and say thank you for straightening out my son or daughter, and because we do have quite a few ladies in the regiment, and that's one of the things that stands out. One of the greatest rewards is the friends I've made right across Canada, and the ability to do things that you normally wouldn't be able to do. As far as driving vehicles, I mean, I've crew commanded Centurion tanks. I was on the with the Strathconas, crew commanding a Centurion tank in the last time before we got the Leopards, that the tanks were with the military. And no, just the ability to do things that you normally wouldn't do. Demolition instructor's course, blowing up things, creating craters, and I took that course out in Chilliwack with with Lindsay Fraser at the time, and we took our families out there and spent 2 weeks in Cultus Lake, and it was quite a nice experience. I've had the opportunity to be across Canada. I've been in most territories and most provinces. It may be a very short time, but through the military.
So those are what you think are beneficial, and it's clear to me from what you're saying to you, what you've said, is that you see that the military training has such positive effects on young people.
Oh, without a doubt. And just the discipline, the ability to organize, and if they come up through the system, the ability to relate to others, how to do things without constant supervision, the planning aspect of it is very important. Something that a lot of times you don't get in civilian work. And I think a lot of the people in the military undersell their abilities when they get out of the military because of the leadership and the instructional capabilities they have, and the ability to adapt and do things. I think the benefits are fantastic.
It kind of comes in that category that the terminology, I think, is soft skills that are so in demand in any industry, mm-hmm. and yet where do you get that experience?
Yeah. And friends of mine, because of their military experience, have ended up with a lot of, with a job that they never would have got without the military background.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah. That's good. Is there anything that sticks out as sort of your crowning achievement that you're most proud of, that the regiment has evolved with, that you had a hand in?
just keeping the regiment on the straight and narrow throughout my tenure, and the ability to participate, to run a successful regiment despite the best efforts and at times of the Department of National Defense to ensure that it would be as difficult as possible, and to contribute to changes. There's a lot of frustrations being in the military and trying to do things because of the rules and regulations, and that instead of doing things that's right, doing things that's political, and no, there's just to be in the regiment and guide it along throughout the years. It's been very rewarding.
So I know that you actually aged out, so to speak, at 60, which is the mandatory retirement for combat arms
for
regiments,
everybody,
pretty much.
Other than the CIC officers.
Yeah, we get a little bit of respite, but after that, you still applied your military skills, I understand. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I worked for Kellyan up in Edmonton, and they've evolved in the simulation center. In fact, I'm going up in a week's time up to Edmonton to participate in an exercise with 1st Brigade. And they're doing it's a computer-assisted training exercise to assist officers and NCOs in running their units in a combat situation.
So you're still involved even now?
I'm still involved in that. I
training.
also worked for Cubic up in Wainwright, running the area weapons effect system.
Talk a little bit about that. That's a kind of an interesting thing that I don't think a lot of people have heard about.
Well, it's like a big paintball game or laser tag game, where every vehicle, or the majority of all the armored vehicles out in the area, they are instrumented with lasers that shoot the gun and show detection systems that detect whether a laser hits the vehicle, and the soldiers have vests on that detect whether they're hit, and they also have rifles that shoot the laser. So it's like a gigantic game of laser tag, but involving up to 4,000 or 5,000 people out in the area.
And I understand that it actually gives, in the computer collection, actually gives you a topographical map, so you can even show where somebody is.
Yeah.
Would be an obvious target. They're easily seen, and that these are things that you utilize to assist in the training and in terms of how you deploy your troops.
I was what they call a trainer, an analyst up there, and we produced the product that enabled the soldiers and the companies, the regiments and that, to figure out what happened, who did what, who did the right thing, who did the wrong thing, and enable them to learn from an exercise. Instead of saying, bang, bang, I got you, we had it on the screen when things happen.
What an absolutely incredible training tool to
Yeah.
be able to be able to provide.
It's a fantastic training tool. And both of them, that and the Callion and the combat, are the simulation center up in Edmonton, are very good training. What it enables you to do is train the headquarters staff, or the officers and the NCOs, in a situation that doesn't abuse the troops. It enables them to learn how to do their job without having the troops involved.
And you can go over that over and over
Yeah.
again, because you've got that permanent record. You can use it as a
Yeah.
resource to any number of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we used to produce discs that we sent back with the units that would enable them to take the lessons learned, teach it as a result of the after action reports and the what we recorded and what we provided them, enable them to learn from that and hopefully improve the next time.
Well, that's really amazing.
And when I was there, we were training the units to go over to Afghanistan. So a lot of it was Afghan-centric training, enable them to go over there and hopefully save a lot of lives through the training that they had. You mentioned the 6-month preparation. These were the final exercises prior to them leaving for Afghanistan.
What a valuable tool.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that that you think that you'd like to express in our interview today?
Well, one of the things that happened too is the flood in '95. That was an interesting experience, because what happened, the flood in '95 took place, and we had down at the river, we had a lot of the British soldiers came in. They came in and absolutely moved equipment, trucks, men in to assist Medicine Hat. And we were sitting there. The Canadian Army out at Suffield couldn't do anything. because of aid to the civil power, which I'm sure you know the rules and regulations. And we had the majority of our soldiers out doing things, but they couldn't put on their uniforms. They couldn't be paid. And I argued with that, and there was a General Miller, who I knew was deputy commander of the area, and got talking. And finally, he made the decision to allow the reserves to participate in this, and I could call out the unit. And it was the first time that something like that had happened at that level in a long time. Interesting history though, when my dad was CO of the unit in '54, they had ice jams on the river, and he called out the unit to sort of mortar the ice jams to try to free them and use explosives. Well, I gather he got in quite a bit of trouble doing that. But anyway, as a result of the exercise, the unit being called out in '95, and I would say as a direct result, the whole emphasis on aid to the civilian communities for the reserves changed. It took a couple years, but lately it's quite easy to get that doing. It used to be tied up with the federal government, the provincial government, and asking for help and that type of thing. And finally they made it, the reserves more responsive to the communities. And that was an interesting experience.
And a positive one. If
Yeah.
you look at the recent ones in Calgary and Medicine
Yeah.
Hat and High River, how rapidly the troops from all
Yeah.
over Alberta were deployed in many different roles.
And that was a direct result. I had to write up an after-action report in that. And I think that came to greatly influence what the rules and regulations were established after that. And it was interesting. We were down the flats, a large part of it flooded. And you were with the police at that time. And we worked quite closely with the police in establishing a cordon around the flats area to ensure that people didn't get in. And we were patrolling, and mind you, we weren't armed or anything. But what we did, if we saw somebody, we spoke to them, and if they wouldn't listen, we called the police in, and it worked really well.
It did. I know I was a
Yeah.
supervisor at the time, and one of the things that I saw was that we had given some of our radios to your major command center, so we had rapid, immediate communication through a command center that you had set up with our radios and yours. So it worked really, really well. And of course, our resources were strapped and limited. We're running double shifts, and we only had so many officers, and so the reservists being able to hold the quarter
It provided
was an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, it provided a augmentation to the police force that has some discipline and the ability to communicate and the ability to follow orders and organize.
And I think that's a really important link, because we are paramilitary organizations, but our communication systems and our protocols are really so closely linked that there wasn't any real education that had to go along with how do we get it done, because you essentially followed a chain of command very similar to the police service. We had a chain of command, and it worked really, really well. It was amazing, and again, I think it just shows the value of the regiment in the community, and not just from a training aspect, from what they actually provide in a crisis situation, and that's a good example.
Well, the regiment is still needing to grow. We still need recruits, but boy, the system sometimes makes it hard for a unit to grow. Cutting back on the amount of recruiting, the recruiting times, and that. I went through, it was interesting reading through some of my notes prior to coming here. A lot of the things that are going on now with recruiting haven't changed throughout the years. There was a Senate report back in the 60s, or the 70s, I think. It was P26, I seem to remember, that identified the problems, and they went for years without doing anything. But now there's some obvious benefits with the pension through the length of time that you're involved with the reserves, which is a very important thing. That's a long-term factor. Medical, dental, if you don't have it, you can get that belonging to the reserves. In addition, scholarships that are available through the unit, through the foundation, which again, the foundation through the, when I was CO, through the interactions with Stan Milner, who was our honorary colonel back then, we established the South Alberta Lighthorse Foundation, which has done a fantastic job in supporting a lot of military projects and the unit in Alberta. 2005, the centennial of the province of Alberta. One of the main displays in the Provincial Museum was the South Alberta Lighthorse. We had a lot of the items that came into our museum were a direct result of that particular function. A lot of things. You meet a lot of people across Canada that you do. The new defense minister, I met him years ago, and he's was with the British Columbia Regiment. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, a tour in Bosnia, and a fantastic individual. And I think hopefully there will be some influence on the reserves as a result of him being defense minister.
I think there's some obviously importance there, but I think that too that, and you may have some statistics, and I'll throw it out if you don't exactly know, but with our time in Afghanistan, it was probably one of the times when the reservists had the greatest percentage of overseas deployments was during our time in Afghanistan in recent history.
Yes, in fact, we've got the battle honor for our new guidon. And if you had a certain number, and I'm not sure, deployed overseas, that becomes a battle honor on your guidon or your colors. And we're one of the units that got it. And I'm not sure of the exact number, but it's about 60 of our unit were overseas. And at one time, we had 23 over there, including the deputy commander of the National Command Element, now General Putt, went over there, and he gathered people around him and took them over there. Our current CO, Troy Steele, went over. And it has been a good influence on the training of the unit. And a lot of people came back with a knowledge and experiences that you don't normally get. I wasn't lucky enough to go overseas, although I did apply a few times, but it just never ended up that I was able to go. And that's one of my regrets. You train for a long time to do something, and then you don't get a chance to do it for real. Although I did a lot of training. I remember having the largest reconnaissance squadron I think ever fielded by the Canadian Army out at Suffield. I had, this was prior, I think it was about 92. And we were out for an exercise in Suffield, and we had the squadron formed by all the Western armored units. And we had 7 troops of 7 vehicles each, an assault troop, A1, A2 echelon and B echelon, plus 4 liaison officers. And it was a fantastic experience. That was one of the experiences that I remember being very rewarding, is being out there and running this large body of men. I mean, a reconnaissance troop squadron, a lot of them are less than 100. I mean, I had one that was absolutely unbelievable, with every item in it that the books say you're supposed to have. And that was a very interesting experience, especially August 22nd, and I remember it was August 22nd. August 21st, we woke up, we're out on exercise, it was hot, above 30 degrees, and the next day we woke up and there was 6 inches of snow on the ground.
Welcome to Southern Alberta.
Yeah, welcome to Southern Alberta, which created all sorts of problems in taking down camp because everything was soaked. Yeah.
Well, and creating the logistics to make that pull that off, that's what a good training opportunity for everybody that was involved in it. Like that really puts your thinking cap on to make sure that you're
well, just the orders and that to make it happen.
Yeah, that's a really complex thing to be able to pull off.
One of the interesting things, we lost a pair of night vision goggles. One of the troops, I think it was the SAS-Ds, lost a pair of night vision goggles. Well, we had visions of them trying to, did somebody try to steal it, or was it actually lost? But it ended up about 5 years later, they found them out. It was in the bag, and they found it out in the area that we were in. And another interesting experience on that exercise, we had some Lord Strathcona lynx, and they were fighting a fire that started. And the lynx started on fire, and it had 3 night observation noddlers in it, quite a few machine guns, and somebody hadn't put the drain plugs in, and the fire started in the engine compartment and went poof. The fire extinguishers didn't work. So ended up that burning out. There was an interesting investigation involved in that.
You can imagine.
Yeah.
Why did the fire extinguishers not work?
I have no idea.
Yeah, but that would be one of the things they would have to try and ascertain. Was it a system failure, or was it a maintenance omission, or?
Because within armored vehicles, they have a halogen, or forget the gas involved that injects it into the compartment if they start on fire. But I remember somebody climbing on it and reaching up and grabbing and pulling themselves up on the vehicle and pulled the fire extinguisher and flooded the interior, which caused all sorts of problems. And then they disconnected them because they didn't want them going off. But if you had a fire, interesting training. Yeah.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation with you, and I guess I'd like to offer you some closing remarks before we end our interview.
Well, thanks very much for allowing me to do this, although I did think I'd done this before, but that was quite a few years ago when we started these interviews. And I think it's been a real, it's too bad that something like this wasn't running earlier, because I think of the people that I met through my career that are not with us anymore, that had a lot of stories to offer. And that's one of the things being involved with the South Alberta Regiment. And I still remember Albert Sergeant Huckyard, and he was the first Canadian into Holland, and he was the first Canadian into Germany. And his claim to fame is he shot a railway gun. You know, one of those big guns that they had on the coast that they used to fire in England? Yeah. He got one with his tank. that would have been an interesting experience. A lot of the interviews that Don Graves, who wrote the South Albertas, wrote our 2 books, conducted. I hope we have a copy of them someplace. We were supposed to get all the materials, and he conducted interviews, but there were quite a few veterans that were alive. But you figure that, you know, right now it's our 71st anniversary of D-Day was this year. I think it was 1944, so 2015, it was the 71st. Not a lot of guys around. I think there are about 20 people left who were in the South Alberta Regiment during the Second World War.
Well, it's certainly a value to be able to capture our history and retain it for future generations. And I think a lot of people don't realize the contributions and the extent to which this regiment has such a proud history going back to 1885. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to think about the 1885 stuff because it's old, but we're creating history every day here. And so, you know, as we move forward to interview people such as yourself, who's had 40 years of, and continuing, because you're not just, you're still involved with...
I'm still vice president of the association. I'm a director of the foundation, so I'm fairly intimately involved. I'm involved with our interviews, the museum. We're doing tours on Monday and Tuesday for some school kids, and
you've been involved with the Royal United Services Institute, which is a parallel paramilitary organization dedicated to the history and perpetuation.
Well, I said the other night, it's been around for about 27 years now, and myself and Paul Mast have about 19 or 20 years as president between the 2 of us. And it's something that got started, and I really enjoy that too. There's some very good presentations. But I'd like to thank you for coming in despite being injured and that. And
yeah, the one wing here I've got for a while, but it's been a pleasure and an honor to be able to interview you today and take this time out. I think it's so valuable. I'm sure that the people that get the chance to see this will have a real different perspective on the regiment and your contributions.
Thank you.
And again, thank you for viewing Alberta's Regiment, a history of the South Albertas, and good afternoon.